If you currently have something like an RTX 3060 or worse, you might be considering upgrading for Monster Hunter Wilds, because honestly, it doesn't run great. Even at the lowest possible settings, you can see that the frame rate in actual gameplay is often 40 FPS or lower, especially as we get into scenes like this one, which are difficult to run. And so I did get a lot of comments on my 5070 Ti review. What about Monster Hunter Wilds? I want to build a PC to run Monster Hunter Wilds well. I've got a big budget set aside for it. Is the 5070 Ti going to do a good job? Well, let's go ahead and pop into some 5070 Ti footage. This is that super demanding on the GPU area, but this time running at 1440p Ultra. But Ultra does use DLSS quality, to be clear, and you can see that we're hitting about a 77 FPS in this super demanding moment. Lots of enemies on screen, long draw distance, and this, at least for the GPU, is one of the hardest scenes of this built-in benchmark. The town area is harder on the CPU, and more on that in a minute, because if you are on an older CPU, upgrading just the GPU to something like a 5070 Ti is not necessarily going to get you the performance that you're looking for in this game. This game is demanding on both the CPU and the GPU. But also I want to give you a bit of a word of caution, because notice that in this demanding gameplay section, the GPU is hitting around 77 FPS, but if I go to the end of this benchmark run, it kind of feels like it's gaslighting me a bit, because it says I'm getting 106 FPS in this built-in benchmark tool. And to be clear, that's what I'm using here. This is the PC benchmark tool that the developers have released, so you can judge if your system is ready for Monster Hunter Wilds. You can download it for free on Steam. But again, if you just run the benchmark and look at the score at the end, I really feel like it's misleading. Let's actually watch a bit of this built-in benchmark to make sure you kind of see what I mean. This built-in benchmark is several minutes long, which is good, but only the mid-third of that or so is actually gameplay. The rest of it is cutscenes, and the cutscenes are way more performant than what we're getting out of the actual gameplay sections. Notice here in this intro cutscene, which takes up the first third or so of this benchmark, we're often seeing frame rates well north of 100 FPS. Certain things are 130, 150 even at times. And this goes on and on and on for quite a while. This is a long section of the benchmark. But notice, it's a cutscene. It doesn't really matter if you're running the cutscene at over 100 FPS if your actual gameplay is running a lot lower. So just cautioning you of that. Because again, I can skip forward, skip forward, skip forward. We're still going. It is still on this intro cutscene. Then it finally hits a loading screen and actually hit some actual gameplay. And notice that our current frame rate around this gameplay section is lower, and it gets worse as we get out into it. So as we go out into this storm, notice that frame rates are more in the upper 80s, low 90s is a lot more typical here, with even some flashes into the 70s. The 1% lows in the section are actually in the 60s. And then actually it gets even more demanding as this storm dissipates. The sun comes out and we see a bunch of monsters over the savannah. So we're going to see that. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is if you're using this built-in benchmark tool, I would caution you to mostly focus on this middle section where it actually shows the character on a mount in the environment rather than just those cutscenes. Because again, right here, notice that frame rates dip a bit, and this tends to be the hardest bit of the whole benchmark, is when you're actually looking out into the distance with monsters on screen in the open world environment. And so I would say if I was trying to target a level of performance I was going to be considering acceptable, this would be what I'd want to be running well. I would care less if my cutscenes were doing, as long as they're at 60, or heck, even a cutscene at 30 is often fine. So that's what I'm saying about, I'm not sure you should read too much into the end number it spits out. I'd focus more on this. With that being said, 1440p Ultra, which does include DLSS quality, that's important, is hitting in the mid 70 FPS range in the most demanding sections on the GPU for this benchmark. But if you're like, well, I'm not spending, MSRP $750, but in reality, we're expecting most models were listed at $900 plus. So these are probably going to be more like in the $900 to $1,000 range if you're buying around the time they launch, which is when Monster Hunter Wilds is coming out. Yeah, you might be thinking like, I'd like to play at native 1080p and not use upscaling. Sorry, 1440p. Well, if we go to 1440p Ultra, but turn off upscaling, which is why it now reports custom settings, but it's the same settings with DLSS turned off. It's just the game uses DLSS by default as part of the Ultra preset. We're now seeing about 65 FPS in this demanding section of the benchmark. So we've gone from about 77-ish to about 65-ish. But we are still, again, if I actually play a bit of this section here, going to be mostly over 60 FPS in this difficult section at ultra settings with no DLSS. Sometimes it dips close to 60. You'll notice the 1% lows do dip beneath this. They are dipping into the 50s, but on a variable refresh rate display, the frame time graph looks pretty good. Anyway, you're gonna be mostly over 60 FPS. But if you were hoping for much better than that, well, that's where it's at. You'd have to turn down settings or use DLSS. Like I said, DLSS quality gets you closer to 77, 78 FPS in that scene. Also, I should mention that I haven't completely maxed this out. While Ultra is the maximum preset in this benchmark, there's also an optional ray tracing, which turns on ray traced reflections. Now, I'll be honest, I watched through the benchmark, and I don't think those ray traced reflections really show up in a meaningful way where I'm sure it's worth the performance hit. But here's Ultra, no upscaling, no ray tracing. Here is Ultra, no upscaling with ray tracing at high. So in the same scene, we've just lost a few more FPS to turn on RT high. Now this isn't necessarily seen with a lot of water. There's a bit of water over here that's probably has a little bit of RT reflections going on here. In general, I'm not really impressed by the RE engine's ray traced reflections. So I would say maybe just leave them off. But if you were gonna turn on, if you wanna see what it's like maxed out at 1440p in the more difficult settings, let's let this play for a minute. You can see that it's around 60 FPS, but it does dip slightly below it momentarily in these more demanding areas. Again, there are some RT reflections going on here, but I can't say I really noticed the difference from this distance or anything like that in the actual image. So there you go. Now, if you're planning on playing on a 4K display, I did also test out 4K Ultra. Now, 4K Ultra does include DLSS quality. So this is DLSS quality built into that graphics preset, but I do think using at least DLSS quality when you're on a 4K display generally makes sense in most titles. You get a lot of performance at almost no perceived loss to detail. Anyway, you can see the end of the benchmark run spits out 77 FPS, but like I've been cautioning you, that doesn't mean the most demanding sections of the actual gameplay featured in the benchmark run are over even 60 FPS at times. You can see here we are dipping below 60 FPS at times, but not usually by much. It does tend to be hovering right around that 60 FPS line. So it does look like 4K Ultra DLSS quality is going to be dipping into the mid-50s, but oftentimes is above that. That's what we've got out of that. So you could go ahead and use DLSS balance, DLSS performance, turn some of the other graphic settings down if you were playing on a 4K display. So it's definitely very usable, but not just like totally a high refresh rate experience on a 4K display. This is also with ray tracing turned off, to be clear. Now, the other thing I want to bring up is that there are other sections of this benchmark that are much more CPU demanding, like this town area. And I'm on a Ryzen 7 9800X3D, which is the most powerful gaming CPU, at least on average. There are certain games where some of the Intel processors do come out ahead. I'm not sure about in this particular title, but this is a very powerful CPU, and so it's eliminating a lot of potential CPU bottlenecks. I want to be clear that if you are on an older CPU and you're thinking about upgrading to the 5070 Ti, you might not see the performance that I'm showing you here. Monster Hunter Wilds, especially in towns, but even when you're just around the monsters and things like that, can be very demanding on the CPU, and so it can be hard to hit high refresh rates on the CPU as well as the GPU. So now, I didn't have time to pop my 5070 Ti into one of my systems with a lower end CPU to compare, but I do have at least one interesting comparison point, which is I did already run a 4K Ultra benchmark on my RTX 4080 in a Ryzen 5000 series CPU system. It's a 5950X, which is 16 core, 32 thread, but only from the Ryzen 5000 series, so much lower gaming performance than what we were seeing on my 9800X 3D. What's interesting is that RTX 4080 generally has a similar gaming performance to the 5070 Ti. So this is very close, I think, to what you would see using a 5070 Ti paired with a Ryzen 5000 series CPU. And what's interesting is if I compare to the 5070 Ti results for DLSS quality, so these at Ultra at 4K, so Ultra settings 4K, notice that we're getting 77 FPS average, whereas on the 4080 system with the Ryzen 5000 series CPU, we're down at around a 69 nice FPS average. So that is making a pretty big difference. Now again, it's not the same GPU, so there's multiple variables here, but in general, that town area can get very CPU limited, especially on older CPUs. So just something to keep in mind on that. If you're also curious, what is this game like if you just break the bank and spend thousands of dollars on the highest end PC you can possibly get, versus what if you got the 5070 Ti, which is still incredibly expensive, but isn't like $2,500 to $3,000 like a 5090, what would you get if you did the 5090? So the 5090 at Ultra at 4K, which again is using DLSS quality as part of that preset, but I did not turn ray tracing on. And this is again on the 9800X 3D to get as much CPU performance as we can. We're averaging 111 FPS. So compared to the 5070 Ti in the same system at 77 FPS, that is a pretty big jump. 111 versus 77. So we could actually get it as a percentage differential if you'd rather take a look at it that way. The 5090 is about 44% more performance. Now it is using the same CPU, and parts of this can be very CPU demanding. So anyway, but we're getting 44% more. It is quite a bit more performance, but is a 5090 at current prices actually worth it? Well, I don't know how much you want to have a super high refresh rate in Monster Hunter. Also, it's going to be interesting to note that this super demanding area right here actually still isn't running at like an amazingly high refresh rate here. I mean, we're getting 90 FPS now, kind of dipping into the upper 80s, low 80s at times, so it's definitely a great experience. But it's not like even a 5090 and a 9800X 3D just magically get you 120 FPS at all times at 4K in this game. So it is just a very demanding game. But yeah, of course, the 5090 is going to give you a much higher refresh rate experience overall. Again, if you're back on a lower end system like a RTX 3060 or a 5600X, you're in pretty rough shape. This is what it looks like at the lowest settings. If you get medium settings but using DLSS performance, which is the medium preset in the game, yeah, that's a 540p internal rendering resolution. You're still only hanging out around 40 FPS in this difficult area of the thing, and things are looking now very smeared from that 540p internal rendering resolution. So anyway, long story short, summary of the video is, yeah, older systems are going to be struggling in this game. But if you're upgrading to a high-end GPU for this game, I would recommend a full system upgrade. You will probably also want a high-end CPU to pair with it, or you will not be getting the full performance out of it. If you are considering the 5070 Ti, especially for a 1440p monitor, it can run the game at ultra settings over 60 FPS in the most demanding areas of the benchmark tool. And there you go. Is it going to be worth it? I mean, if you can snag one of these at their MSRP when it launches tomorrow, $750 for this kind of performance is fairly good. It's not the most amazing generational uplift, but it is better than what we had previously at that price point. If you're getting this closer to $900, it's about the same performance per dollar as you could have got last year from a 4070 Ti Super, but if you didn't buy one of those, at least it's not worse. If you're paying $1,000 or more for the 5070 Ti, just be aware you're getting worse value as far as performance per dollar than you could have got a year ago. But hey, at least if you're just, man, I don't even care, you just want to play Monster Hunter Wilds and have it run well, it can do that. Anyway, that's what I've got for you guys today. Hopefully you found it useful and or interesting. I saw a lot of people commenting on my 5070 Ti review that they wanted to see Monster Hunter Wilds. So here it is. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Maybe when the game finally launches, there'll be a little more optimization. We'll see. But my guess is if they released a performance measuring benchmark for PC users, it's probably not going to be too far off from what you'll actually see in game. But again, caution about the number at the end, using those cutscenes to kind of inflate performance. I hope all of you have an excellent day.